I was sitting on a bench outside Marv's Diner on West Madison, eating a cold egg sandwich I'd packed from home, watching the morning crowd rush past like they had somewhere important to be. Which, I suppose they did. I just wasn't one of them anymore. My son had called the night before and told me to come by his office at 10. He said it was nothing serious, just some paperwork on the building. Routine stuff, he called it. Sign here, sign there, and we'll grab lunch after. I'd heard that before the we'll grab lunch after part, and we never did. But I still put on my good gray shirt, the one my wife bought me 3 Christmases before she passed, and I took the 7:15 bus from Elmwood Park, because my truck had been making a sound I didn't trust, and I wasn't about to spend money on a cab just to ride 20 minutes in silence. The building my son was talking about was mine. I want to be clear about that. I built that building not with investors, not with a bank loan I couldn't afford, but with 31 years of working construction in the Chicago winters, saving every dollar I could pull back from the household budget without my wife noticing, and eventually buying a rundown commercial property on Halsted Street that everybody told me was a mistake. I fixed it up on weekends. I poured the new concrete myself. I called in every favor I had from every subcontractor I'd ever worked alongside. My son Nathan was in college when I started. By the time I finished, he had his real estate license and his first suit, and a way of talking about money that made me feel like I'd been doing everything wrong my whole life. I loved him for it, honestly. I was proud. I figured that's what fathers work for, so their sons can become something they themselves never had the education to be. I was sitting there with my egg sandwich when I noticed the man at the next table. He was older than me, which doesn't happen as often as you'd think when you're 64. Maybe 75, maybe older. Thin, the way men get thin when they've been sick, or when they've simply stopped paying attention to meals. He had on a jacket that had probably been nice 20 years ago, dark green with brass buttons, and he was struggling with the lid on a paper coffee cup, those lids that snap on too tight and require 2 good hands and a little bit of aggression to get off. His hands were shaking. Not dramatically, not the kind of shaking that stops you cold, but enough that the cup kept sliding on the table and the lid wasn't giving. Nobody around him was paying any attention. The young couple 2 tables over were looking at a phone. The woman in the business suit near the door was typing something with both thumbs. A teenager with earbuds walked past him so close the breeze moved the man's napkin, and the kid never looked up. I watched for about 30 seconds, which is longer than it sounds when you're watching someone struggle, and then I folded up my sandwich wrapper, stood up, and walked over. "Can I get that for you?" I said. He looked up at me like he was surprised anyone had spoken to him. Not startled, just surprised, the way you get when you've been invisible long enough that attention feels unfamiliar. "I'd be grateful," he said. I popped the lid off it, took a little work, I won't lie, and set it down on the table. He thanked me and wrapped both hands around the cup like it was the warmest thing he'd touched all morning. It might have been. I started to turn back to my bench, and he said, "Would you like to sit? If you're not in a rush." I looked at my watch. I had 40 minutes before I needed to be at Nathan's office. The bus ride had gone faster than I expected, and I hadn't wanted to walk in too early, which always made me feel like I was asking for something. "Sure," I said. I sat down across from him and introduced myself. His name was Gerald. He didn't offer a last name right away, and I didn't ask for one. That's not how men our age introduce themselves. You give the first name, you shake hands, you figure out the rest as you go. We talked the way strangers talk when neither of them has somewhere urgent to be, which is to say, honestly. He asked me what I did, and I told him I was retired from construction, 31 years in the trades, mostly commercial and industrial, some residential toward the end when my knees started making opinions known. He nodded slowly, like that information meant something to him. "And now," he said. "Now I'm heading to see my son," I said. "He has a real estate office over on North LaSalle. We have a property together, and there's some paperwork." "A property you built?" I looked at him. "How'd you know I built it?" He smiled a little. "You said you were in construction for 31 years and that your son is in real estate. It seemed like the natural connection." I laughed. "Yeah, building on Halsted. Commercial space, 4 tenants. I've owned it outright for 9 years. Nathan manages it now, handles the leases, the maintenance calls." I paused. "He's better at that part than I ever was." "You trust him," Gerald said. It wasn't really a question, but I answered it anyway. "He's my son," I said. which I realized even as I said it wasn't quite the same thing. Gerald looked at his coffee cup for a moment. Then he looked at me. "What kind of paperwork?" He said it's an insurance update. Liability coverage, something to do with one of the tenants and a slip and fall from last winter. Said they need my signature to process the new policy. "Did he send you the documents beforehand?" I shifted in my seat. He said he'd have everything ready at the office. Easier to go through it in person. Gerald didn't say anything to that. He just nodded in that slow way again, and I felt something uncomfortable move through me, the way you feel when someone holds a mirror up at an angle you weren't expecting. We talked for another 20 minutes about other things. He asked about my wife. I told him about Patricia, about how she'd been gone 4 years now, how the apartment was too quiet in the mornings, how I'd started keeping the television on not because I was watching it, but because silence at 64 is a different thing than silence at 40. He listened in a way that most people don't anymore, without looking at his phone, without preparing what he was going to say next while I was still talking. When I stood to leave, he stood too. "I'm heading that direction as well," he said, folding the newspaper he'd had tucked under his arm. "North LaSalle. I have an appointment at 11. We walked together. He moved a little slower than me, but not much, and he talked about Chicago, the way people talk about a city they've watched change over decades, with a kind of affectionate grief, appreciating what it had become while mourning what it had been. He'd been in the city a long time, he said, longer than he'd expected when he arrived. I didn't ask what he did. I don't know why, exactly. Maybe because he hadn't told me and I respected that. Maybe because it didn't seem like the point of the conversation. When we reached the building on North LaSalle, the one with the glass lobby and the name of my son's firm printed in clean sans serif letters on the door, I held it open for Gerald and followed him in. My son was standing near the reception desk, talking to a young woman in a blazer. He was in his element the way he always was in that office, tall, well-dressed, carrying himself like a man who knew exactly what every square foot of the room was worth. He'd gotten that from his mother's side, the ease in rooms that had nothing to do with him. I'd always admired it. I still did. He looked up when we came through the door. I watched the smile begin to form on his face, the professional greeting smile that he put on for clients and kept on for me. And then his eyes moved to Gerald and the smile didn't finish. It stopped somewhere in the middle. His jaw didn't drop. Nothing dramatic. But the color went out of his face, the way color goes out of a room when a cloud passes over the sun, fast, complete, and immediately obvious to anyone who was looking. "Dad," he said. His voice was normal, but he was staring at Gerald. "This is Gerald," I said. We walked over together from Marv's. My son said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then, "Mr. Gerald, I didn't know you were." He stopped himself. "I have a conference room ready." "For me?" Gerald said pleasantly. "For my father. For the paperwork." Nathan was recovering, pulling the professional smile back into place. But it was the kind of recovery you notice because you had to watch it happen. We went to the conference room. It was a nice room, a long table, a view of the street, a stack of documents already laid out in the center. Nathan had a pen uncapped and ready, which struck me later how ready everything was. He slid the documents toward me and started explaining in the smooth, quick voice he used when he wanted to get through something before questions slowed him down. Insurance update, liability coverage, new policy language, standard transfer clause. Just need your signature on pages 3, 7, and the last page. I reached for the documents. Gerald put his hand on the table, not on the documents, just on the table, and said, quietly, "Walter, would you mind if I read those first?" Nathan's head came up. "Gerald, with respect," my son said, and his voice had changed slightly, a tightness in it. "This is a private family matter." "I'm sure it is," Gerald said. He pulled the documents toward himself with the steady, unhurried confidence of a man accustomed to reading things people would prefer he didn't, and he began to read. The room was very quiet. I watched my son. He had both hands flat on the table in front of him, very still, the way a man goes still when he's running calculations he doesn't want showing on his face. I had seen that look before, not on Nathan, but on contractors who had overbid a job and were hoping no one would check the numbers. Gerald read for several minutes. He turned pages slowly, went back to a page he'd already read, turned it again. He set the documents down. "Walter," he said, "this is not an insurance update." I looked at him. Page 7 is a deed transfer. If you sign here, this building transfers out of your name and into the name of a holding company. He slid the document across to me and pointed. I looked where his finger was. I am not a lawyer. I am not a man who reads contracts. But the words were clear enough when I knew what to look for. My name going out. An LLC name I didn't recognize going in. I looked at my son. Nathan had not moved. It's a formality, he said finally. The holding company is ours, Dad. It's just better for liability purposes, better for taxes, the accountant recommended. Whose name is on the holding company? Gerald said. A long pause. It's structured for the management company, as Nathan exhaled. It protects the asset. Whose name, Gerald said again, is on the holding company? Nathan looked at me. Not at Gerald. At me. And in that look I saw something I hadn't let myself see in a long time. Or maybe I had seen it and just kept finding other explanations for it. The slight impatience when I asked questions. The way he handled all the building's finances now, without showing me the books. The Christmas 2 years ago when his wife, a perfectly nice woman who had grown less perfectly nice since their income went up, had said, within my hearing, that the building was under-leveraged and Nathan needed to stop being sentimental about it. My son had not answered the question. Nathan, I said. His name, just his name, the way his mother used to say it when there was no anger in her voice, but there was something worse than anger. He sat down. He rubbed his face with both hands. And then, because whatever else he was still my son, and he had never been a good liar when I was looking him in the eyes, he told me. The holding company was in his name. Only his name. The transfer would have moved the building, my building, the one I poured concrete for on January mornings when the temperature was in the single digits entirely out of my ownership. I would have had nothing. No equity, no stake, no claim. He had already lined up a buyer. The sale, he said, would close within 30 days of the transfer. His voice was flat by the time he finished, the flatness of someone who has been caught and has decided that confessing quickly is better than confessing slowly. And then what? I said. What was I supposed to do? Where was I supposed to live? He didn't answer. Nathan. I said his name again. I'm 64 years old. I have Social Security and a building. That's what I have. You knew that. He looked at the table. That building paid for your college, I said. Not the building I own now, I bought that after. But the extra shifts, the overtime, the weekends, I didn't come to your games because I was working, that's what paid for your college, and your first car, and the deposit on your first apartment. I stopped. My voice was doing something I didn't want it to do. Something that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with a tiredness I'd been carrying around and not naming. I was coming here today to sign a paper because I trusted you. My son said nothing. Gerald had been silent through all of this. Now he spoke. Nathan, he said, my name is Gerald Harmon. I've been a federal judge in the Northern District of Illinois for 22 years. I retired from the bench 14 months ago. I currently consult for the Cook County State's Attorney's Office on real estate fraud cases. He said all of this in the same quiet, even voice he'd used to talk about Chicago over coffee. I want you to understand that I'm not telling you this as a threat. I'm telling you so that you understand the nature of what you almost did this morning and what the accurate legal term for it would be. The young woman in the blazer who had been hovering near the conference room door took one slow step backward into the hallway. Nathan was very still. Your father is not going to sign these documents, Gerald said, and I'm going to recommend, strongly, that he retain an attorney to review all existing agreements related to this property, because where there is one document like this, there are usually others. He folded his hands on the table. What you do with that information is your business. But I've spent a long time watching people make decisions in rooms like this one, and I can tell you with some confidence that the next decision you make is going to matter quite a lot. We left the conference room without the signed documents. In the lobby, the woman at the reception desk looked up and then immediately looked back down at her computer. The glass door opened. The Chicago morning was still there, the noise of the street, the late October sun coming in low and bright at an angle that made everything look more consequential than it probably was. Gerald and I stood on the sidewalk. I didn't know what to say. There's a kind of shock that isn't loud. It doesn't knock you down or make you grab a wall. It just settles over you quietly, like a drop in temperature, and you stand in it and try to remember what you were doing before it started. I'm sorry, I said finally. You have nothing to apologize for, Gerald said. I should have read the documents myself. Yes, he said, you should have. But you trusted your son, which is not a character flaw. It's just something that has to be re-examined now. He said it gently, the way you say a hard thing when you genuinely don't want to make it worse. We walked to the corner. He gave me the name of an attorney he trusted, a real estate lawyer in the loop, said to use his name when I called. I wrote it in my phone with my bifocals because my distance vision is fine, but close-up things have been blurry since I turned 60, and I held the phone at arm's length and typed it in wrong the first time, and Gerald waited without saying anything. I called the attorney that afternoon. Within a week, she had gone through every document Nathan had given me to sign over the previous 2 years. 3 of them contained language I had not understood. None of them were what I had been told they were. She filed the necessary paperwork. The building stayed in my name. Nathan called me once, 3 weeks later. He said he was sorry. He said it had been Marlene's idea, his wife's idea, and that he had let himself get talked into something he knew was wrong. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if it matters which one of them thought of it first. The deed transfer was in his handwriting, and he had been the one sitting across the table from me, with a pen uncapped and ready. I said I needed time. He said he understood. I have seen Gerald 3 times since that morning. Once for coffee at Marv's, which felt like the right place to go back to. Once when he invited me to a talk he gave at a bar association luncheon, which was not my usual setting, but I sat in the back row and thought about how a man can spend 40 years in a courtroom and still have trouble getting the lid off a paper coffee cup. Once more in November when we walked along the lakefront for an hour and didn't talk about Nathan at all. Just talked about the city and the cold and what it means to get older in a place you've watched change. I don't know what the future looks like with my son. I know what it doesn't look like. It doesn't look like it did last October, when I was walking to his office in my good gray shirt, thinking the worst thing that might happen was that we wouldn't get around to having lunch. Some version of trust, once it cracks in a particular way, doesn't go back to what it was. It might become something else. I'm not ready to say yet. What I know is this. I packed a sandwich that morning because I didn't want to spend the money on breakfast out. I sat on a bench because I had extra time and the bench was there. I stood up and walked over to a man struggling with a coffee lid because that is, as far as I can tell, the only appropriate thing to do when someone near you is struggling and you have 2 free hands. None of that felt significant while I was doing it. It felt like an ordinary Tuesday morning. The kind of morning you don't remember 6 months later because nothing about it was supposed to matter. I'm 64 years old. I have been in the trades my whole life, which means I understand, at a cellular level, that the materials you use determine what the structure can hold. You can't pour a weak foundation and expect a strong building. You can cut corners in a dozen places, and sometimes it holds anyway, but eventually, something shifts, and the weakness is where everything fails. I built something honest, and it lasted 31 years. I am still standing in it. My son built something on a different kind of material. I hope he rebuilds. I hope he does it slowly and with attention to what he's actually laying down. I hope his wife either helps him with that or gets out of the way. But that's his work to do. Mine was always simpler. Be useful. Pay attention. Don't walk past someone who needs a hand, because you have no idea who that person is or what the morning will turn into after you've helped them. You don't do it because of what might happen. You do it because a man is struggling with a coffee lid and you're standing right there. That has always been enough. That has always been everything.